Hi, everyone. My name is Rahul Verma. I work here at the Center for Policy Research. Thank you for joining us in this series, How India Votes. This is our third iteration and the final one for this month. And then we'll have three more conversations in the month of August. And as some of you who would have joined in the previous two occasions, you know the idea behind this series is to discuss Indian politics and Indian elections from a long long point of view, because mostly events on elections, even at CPR, used to happen just before or after the election, where all the focus is either understanding what is going to shape the election verdict or why we got the result that we got. And the idea behind this series is that there are some important questions that we need to understand and try to basically take a more comprehensive and holistic approach to study of Indian elections and also study of Indian democracy. Today, I'm joined by two friends of Center for Policy Research and also my close mentors, Mukulika Banerjee, who's associate professor at London School of Economics. She teaches anthropology there. Professor Banerjee has several books to her credit, the latest one being Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India, which actually draws on her more than a decade's worth of ethnographic work in two villages of West Bengal. She also wrote Why India Votes, and in that book, there were like 10 or 10, more than 10 sites were actually studied for more than 2 months in the run-up to 2009 elections, where people spoke to, or the researchers on the ground spoke to multiple citizens and candidates to understand why do Indians actually participate in election. And she also has a couple of other books. One is on Sari, and then there is another book, The Pathan, Unarmed Opposition and Memory in the Northwestern Frontier. The second guest today is Irfan Nuruddin. Nuruddin is professor of Indian politics in the Asian Study program in the School of Foreign Services at Georgetown University. Irfan has been writing on Indian politics and Indian elections for a very, very long time. His first book, which was from his PhD, which was based on his PhD dissertation, Coalition Politics and Economic Development. And it's an important book, especially now that we have two giant coalitions going to fight the 2024 election. And for a long time, this mythical idea that, coalitions are actually not good for economic development. Irfan's book actually demonstrates that, coalitions actually, things are slow, but once the decision is taken, it's get implemented. And some of those decisions are actually better than single party majority government. Irfan also works on issues of democratization. His second book is Elections in Hard Times, Building Stronger Democracies in the 21st Century. And his most recent book, The Everyday Crusade, Christian Nationalism in American Politics, came out last year. Welcome, Irfan and Mukulika. Thank you for joining us today. And so the topic for today's conversation is voter turnout and why India votes. And the reason I thought we should discuss turnout in the beginning for multiple reasons. First, the nature of, so vibrant elections are necessary for vibrant democracy, but it's not a sufficient condition. And in some ways, there is now a debate on the nature of Indian democracy, and many things about Indian politics are changing. And so we should also have a fresh outlook towards what it means to turn out in Indian elections, who are turning out, and what does it mean for Indian trajectory of Indian democracy in future. But just to start with, let me sort of like lay out some facts on the table, which can also steer the conversation today. What has happened in Indian politics over a couple of decades, that the turnout has steadily increased. And India now, basically in the last election, we had 67.6% turnout. And if you compare it with other democracies which don't have compulsory voting mechanism, Indian turnout by that standard is really, really high. And with that increased turnout, what we are also witnessing, there was a gender gap in turnout, which means that earlier women used to turn out lesser in election. That gender gap since 90s have been slowly closing. And in 2019, actually, there was no difference between men and women turnout. Uh, Third, what we know about Indian politics of 90s, and especially Yogendra Yadav's famous second democratic upsurge argument, which made this point, that in Indian politics, compared to more mature Western democracies, what seems to be happening that the bottom half of the pyramid is participating in electoral arena more. And this is sort of like this defies the conventional wisdom. What we know in like 2009, 2014, it seems that some of the potentials of that second democratic upsurge stagnated. And so there was no more sort of like positive strides in that direction. In fact, my hunch suggests, and especially for Muslim turnout, that it may not just have stagnated, but it has actually declined in last two elections. We don't have good evidence to make that case, but this is what preliminary evidence suggests. Fourth, what also seems to be happening, earlier in 2000s, the turnout among young voters used to be lower than the average turnout. So young voters, meaning in the category of 18 to 25 years. In 2014 and in 2019, the turnout of young voters, as pointed out by Lokniti National Election Studies data, that the turnout among younger voters were high, right? And they were mobilized in much more than in previous election. Given that there is so much of economic anxiety, especially among younger people, how are they going to participate from now on? And final point, what we seems to be like witnessing geographically, that some states, especially in the south and east, say West Bengal and Assam and Manipur and Tamil Nadu and Kerala, their turnout rates are actually very high, around 85, 90 percentage points in both assembly and Lok Sabha elections, where the northern states still lagged. So UP, Bihar still turns out in late 50s and early 60s. They are catching up, but there is this geographical divide in terms of where the turnout is happening. And so I thought what I'll do today, first I'll get Mukulika and then Irfan to join, like, make some opening remarks, and then we'll have Q&A. But for audience, I'll request you that if you have questions, please put in Q&A box. Irfan, Mukulika, and I'll try to respond some of them on Q&A box. Whatever is left, I will basically take them at the end. So if you have any questions and comments, please keep putting them in your chat box or Q&A box. So let me bring Mukulika first in, since she's one of the few people who actually wrote about participation of Indian citizens in elections as some kind of celebration for them. In fact, like if you read her work, she says that in rural areas, people actually wear new dresses when they are going to the polling booth, right? An occasion to celebrate, because that's bringing them into mainstream of body politics. But there is also this theorization about Indian politics that there's a lot of money that flows during elections, and people actually turn out just to oblige to their sort of political local politicians, right? And so it's basically the saris and samosas and some gifts which is bringing them to booth, rather than some grand ideas about participation in electoral process. And so is it changing, and how does she sees why do people actually participate in elections?
Okay, thank you, Rahul, and just quick thanks also for including me in this series, which you have curated so beautifully. And it's going to be hopefully a lasting resource for all new researchers, young scholars, and so on. It's a great privilege to be able to share it, and also on a platform and an institution like CPR, the Center for Policy Research, which, as myself and many, many colleagues around the world have continually attested in these last very difficult months that CPR has faced, that whatever happens, it remains a preeminent institution for rigorous and evidence-based study of India. And I think that's what both Irfan and I are here to contribute, and all the other contributors are here to share what we know on this platform, because it is CPR. So thank you. And I know I speak on behalf of both of us and other speakers. So with the time I have, I thought what I'd do is make 3 points today. One is the first will be a set of issues around why India votes, as Rahul has asked me to do. The second point will be what are the new research questions that are emerging around the issue of participation and turnout, given the changing nature of Indian polity, because obviously new things are happening in Indian democracy every day. And therefore, as researchers, as people who study and try and understand what's happening in Indian politics, what are the new questions that are coming up? And finally, just a point to be made, which I think the study of Indian politics has demonstrated very convincingly over the years, not least because of the collaborative nature between qualitative and quantitative researchers. We all read each other's work, which is quite unusual in most fields of any study, of any topic, is just a reminder how important mixed methods is to really understand Indian politics. So that's a brief point at the end. So let me start with the first one about why India votes. Rahul's given you a terrific background to this. India bucks the global trend on many things around turnout. Socially disadvantaged people vote more than rich urban ones. Women vote as much, if not more, than men, and I'll talk a lot more about that, again, as Rahul has requested. And thirdly, very importantly, the turnout at local elections is much higher. Local elections is higher than state elections is higher than national elections. So the most important elections in which everybody participates, I mean, this village where I've been doing my research for over 20 years now, everybody shows up to vote at the panchayat election. And these are against the global trends in other older democracies and contemporary ones. Now, why is this the case? And this was my research. So this is really to recap work that is published and out there, but just to remind ourselves what the main messages are. First is that to remember the reason why elections have become these sacrosanct moments where people feel they have to participate without thinking about it, is because, and the reason why it's celebrated like a festival and why people dress up, I think is because evidence from across India shows 12 researchers in different parts of India studied different sites for why India votes. And everybody was reporting that if you are socially disadvantaged in India, this is the one moment, and perhaps the only moment, where you experience what political equality actually feels like. You know, you live in a democracy, that there is an aspiration to equality, but this is when you actually experience it. The orderly queues of the polling station, the complete social mixing that occurs in any polling station, and the respect with which election commission officials treat any voter, regardless of who they are. The fact that their names are called out, for many people, it's the first time they hear their names being said in public. And this is really quite a big deal for a lot of people. So the act of voting itself is very significant and therefore sacrosanct. And that's why my first paper on this was called Sacred Elections. Now, of course, there is no denying that there is money and muscle involved in Indian elections. And what Rahul was saying earlier in his opening remarks is absolutely true. People get a lot of benefits, incentives, bribes from various political parties. And socially disadvantaged people from across India will say this to anyone who asks them. They said, of course we take athari, of course we take kerosene. If your children can't do homework because there is no light in the house and somebody gives you a liter of kerosene free, of course you'll take it. If you have one toned sari and the other one is also toned and somebody gives you a free one, of course you'll take it. But what on earth does that have to do with who I vote for? I will show up to the polling station because I think it is important, but not because somebody, and people have said this to me many times, that you think my vote is worth 1 liter of kerosene? Is that all? I can sell such a valuable thing for that? And with this evidence that the team for Why India Votes collected, we push back against Pradeep Chibber and Amit Ahuja's argument in the paper that they make, that the argument they make there is that people in rural areas, people in disadvantaged positions, have a clientelistic relationship with the state. People vote because they want to make sure that they get the benefits from the state. The words for this are various now, whether it is Labh Bharti, whether it is Revri benefits. But basically, poor people ensure this, and it's a sense of empowerment, making sure that they're noticed by the state because they are neglected a lot of the time. And in contrast, urban, more literate people who in fact have exited the state, they don't send their children to state schools or use government hospitals, go to vote out of a sense of civic duty. This is the Chibber Ahuja argument. And we push back against that to say that actually, if you talk to a lot of people who have nothing, who are in fact reliant on, say, employment through Manrega or through benefits of different kinds of the welfare state, they too have a sense of civic duty. So we should not assume that if you are in a position where you need the state to support your livelihood, you don't have a sense of civic duty. In fact, people have a very articulate sense of why they think the voting is both a duty and a right. So there is, and there's an elaborate discussion of this in Why India Votes for whoever wants to read it. The second thing to say about voting and why people vote and our increasing turnout numbers is also, something that Ambedkar said back in 1919. He made the case that suffrage could itself serve as an instructive role, and that participation in political life would bring about consciousness. And this was at the heart of introducing universal suffrage, that actually the act of going to participate itself raises consciousness. Every experience of political equality or participation raises that. So, when we are celebrating 70 years, 75 years, we must remember this. And remember also that Indian citizens don't just vote once in every 5 years. They vote several times because there are 3 tiers of democracy. So the motivations for voting are various. So, and again, please ask questions. I'll be happy to fill them in. The second point now about what kind of new research questions are emerging. And here I just want to, obviously there are many and we should talk about them and this series will throw them up, but there are 2 that I want to focus on today. One is the issue of women and their vote, which is an absolutely startling development in Indian elections. And the second one is variable turnout, and I'll come to that in a minute. But first, let me talk about women because I hear that it came up in the first of these series where Pradeep Chibber and Rajdeep Sardesai were discussing. Everybody's noticed this. And there are various kinds of, it's particularly striking because in a sense, India had a significant gender gap like many other democracies, and it's caught up. And remember, in India, our sex ratio is very bad. It's 186 out of 194 countries, 943 women out of 1,000 men. This is the last 2011 census. But there has been a narrowing, and now we are seeing an outstripping. And this is not just in the southern and eastern states where the gender ratio is higher, but also in northern and western states like Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, UP, where also where human development indicators and sex ratios are much worse, women are voting more than men. And men's turnouts actually have remained pretty much the same according to the Election Commission of India data. Now, in 2019, women's turnout outstripped in the Lok Sabha elections, and as we've seen since then, the state assembly elections, this continues to be the case. There are existing explanations. Various people, Sanjay Kumar and Pranav Gupta wrote a paper about this, and many people have engaged with this. But this paper by Kumar and Gupta, they talk about 3 possible explanations: the self-empowerment hypothesis, an increase in female literacy, and deeper penetration of media. And other people have discussed other factors as well. I just want to add to these existing explanations 3 further observations, which I propose to be at least their observations, their correlations. I'm not sure about its causality, but it's precisely the nature of these new research questions that we've got to explore it further. First is, it is interesting that they are rising since 2009. And 3 things have happened around in the decade preceding 2009. The first thing is a negative development, which is women's participation in labor participation ratio. Labor force participation ratio has been declining. So at the time that women are having to exit the labor force, their turnouts are rising. Are these 2 things linked? We need to examine this very carefully. It's almost as if you lose a voice in the economy, you gain a voice in politics. Is this the case? If there is certainly a correlation, what is the relationship? The second observation to make is that in the decade preceding 2009, as these women are coming of age, is also when the Panchayati Raj, the 73rd, 74th Amendment institutions, the PRIs, are maturing, right? And these are local elections, therefore, both in urban and rural bodies, and therefore elections become way more proximate, something where these are elections in which everybody knows the names of the candidates, and very critically, these are the only elections where there is reservation for women. Right? So 33 to 50% reservation for women candidates. So women are seeing women like themselves, women they know standing for and winning elections, making elections a much more proximate phenomenon than more remote state and Lok Sabha elections. The third factor could be that this is also the decade when self-help groups absolutely proliferate across India. And again, they have a very diverse career across the country. And in a paper recently published earlier this year, I think, yes, called on self-help groups, I make the argument that the economic empowerment that self-help groups were meant to achieve is very variable, and the jury is out. There's a huge literature on this saying this is actually a neoliberal capture. This is not actually empowering women. It actually causes more indebtedness, etc. There's lots of critiques of self-help groups. But having observed a self-help group form in front of my eyes in the village where I was working, and then seeing how it actually affects the electoral outcome in that particular village and that party, one can make the argument that self-help groups create what I call civic growth. Now, civic growth, like economic growth, could be a measure of political participation and political capacity in any population. The ability to be able to organize, to work with people who you don't know, to learn to deliberate, to learn to make collective decisions, etc. Things that are absolutely germane to democratic politics and democratic culture is what I call civic growth. And this civic growth is created through the participation in self-help groups. And I use Hannah Arendt's idea of natality, her idea of politics as action, to describe this. And this is borne out by the work of Paramita Sanyal, for instance, also working in West Bengal, and Vijendra Rao, who've been showing that actually women's ability to speak up in panchayat meetings and other meetings when they belong to self-help groups is greatly enhanced. And I take this further by saying that not only is their civic growth, their political capacity increasing, but this capacity can have a direct impact on electoral politics. And I show this with evidence from my village. So those are my 3 possible explanations for women's rise in turnout, the labor participation, labor force participation falling, the Panchayati Raj institutions and the increase in civic groups through self-help groups. The second research question, which I just wanted to signal, and I know I'm out of time, so I'm just going to show you. Now, we should, again, Rahul has very helpfully mentioned two things. One is that India bucks the trend. Our turnouts are going up. Every Indian election sees a greater participation, and that this upsurge seems to continue. And of course, this upsurge, as I've been showing through the women's question, is that it is actually women's greater participation that is causing this to rise. Having said that, more fine-grained data shows that if you actually break down turnout by parliamentary constituencies, you see that this turnout is not increasing uniformly. In some constituencies, it actually declines. In others, it increases. And very helpfully, this is visualized terrifically by the Trivedi Center for Political Data under the leadership of Gilles Vernier. And their website actually lays this out. So for those of you who are not familiar with TCPD data, I'm going to share the screen briefly for you to just see what it looks like, and you can then follow it up quite easily. So let me just show you on your screens what this looks like. So this is, by the way, the homepage of TCPD there, and I've gone to their Lok Dhaba under visualizations page. And if you go to the Lok Dhaba page, you can select any state you want in India. And here I've selected West Bengal. It's the state I know best. And I have no time to explain and discuss this, but we can do this in the discussion. But if you just look, you see below here, I've clicked 2009. This is the turnout percentages in Lok Sabha in 2009, right? Now you look at the color shading, and you will see on your screens this percentage here, that if there is a decline, it is red. If it is an increase, and it can decline by over 10%, it can increase by over 20%. And there are some constituencies in which there is a quite significant decline. In others, there is quite significant increase. In 2014, the same map looks very different. There are some in which there is a huge increase where there was a decrease before. And by 2019, again, this changes. Right? Let me show you for one more state. If you pick Uttar Pradesh, again, if you look at 2019, you start with the present. There are some constituencies in which there is a significant over 5%, over 7% increase. In others, there is very significant decrease in turnout. If you go back, this was absolutely not the case in the previous Lok Sabha election. The same constituencies where we saw this decrease in 2014 had seen an increase of nearly 20%, and in 2009 and so on. So my point here is basically just to, let me stop sharing my screen. Sorry. Do you think by this stage in our careers, we would have learned to do the, is it stop sharing?
Yes.
Yes, so the point to make here, I'm not providing any analysis, as you can see at this point, but this is a research question. We hear a lot of anecdotal evidence for people of voter suppression, basically. So if more people are going to vote, who are these new people? Are they young people? Are they women? Are there certain communities who didn't used to vote, who are going out to vote more? If there is such a decline, more than 20% in some cases, what is the demographic? Is this a suppression of the Muslim vote in certain constituencies of UP and indeed other parts of India? We are hearing a lot of anecdotal evidence that the police are given instructions that they have to show a 15% decline in turnouts, that women are targeted for their clothes. If they have face coverings, then they are likely to be Muslim. Those women then choosing to wear saris, but then are identified because of their tan lines, because half their faces are darker than others. I mean, this is the kind of instructions that the police is getting from the administration. We hear this from people on the ground. We hear this anecdotally, and there's lots said anecdotally about Indian elections. So our job as researchers is really to test it with data, and TCPD has done this, the hard work of testing this. So this is just to end the, I'll end by just saying that this particular, both the women and the voter turnout questions, as you can see, it's impossible to do it by only one set of methods, only one kind of data. We need the big picture, like those visualization maps show us, but we also need to have the rapport with people to be able to ask questions, to be there to observe, always asking questions. As an anthropologist, I will always believe this, that you've got to watch what people do, not just listen to what they say. And we need mixed methods to really understand Indian politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Mukulika. We'll come back to some of the questions you have raised on women's participation. But I just wanted to sort of like, and perhaps my reading of Pradeep Chibbar and Amit Ahuja paper is different, not because Pradeep is my PhD advisor, because I think there is much more similarity on what you are arguing and what Pradeep Chibbar and Amit Ahuja argued. I think they, in fact, were one of those who argued against the clientelism thesis. In fact, the title of the paper was, if I don't vote for this, if I don't vote, I'm dead for the state. So for poor, their argument was that poor votes for rights, and whereas the middle classes vote because of duty. But we may have different readings of this paper. Irfan, now I want to bring you in, and please feel free to improvise if you have things to add. But I have some questions for you. And the questions are following. One, you study political parties and you've also written on voter turnout. Given that there is a consensus that political parties in India are organizationally weak, how do we see so much of turnout? Because it's the job of parties to mobilize voters. Are people turning out without any sort of mobilization? Second question, and now there is some evidence, but given turnout is so important, actually it has not received enough scholarly attention. There is some work, but not a whole body of work that we can basically talk about, like some correlates of turnout, the graphics Mukulika just showed. We don't know why some areas turn high, some areas turn low, and why there is so much fluctuation happening. And then we have this mythical idea, which is, that turnout goes up, then there is going to be anti-incumbency sentiments, though data doesn't support any of these things. And so on any of these aspects, if you have things to add or things that you would like to talk about turnout, your own hypothesis, what we should study going forward.
Thank you, Rahul. Appreciate the opportunity to be part of this wonderful series. Always daunting to follow the footsteps of Pradeep and Rajdeep, Gilles, and Sanjay Kumarji. Glad to see Gilles on the attendance list for today's talk as well. His leadership of the Trivedi Center has been truly remarkable, and I appreciate Mukulika shouting them out. And at the start of this, maybe I could also add my thanks and gratitude to the Center for Policy Research for being such an incredible non-partisan institution, of sort of an example of what the best kind of think tank can be in any democracy. So really wonderful to be part of this. I should also say, just for those young academics out in the audience, a pro tip: if you're speaking on a panel on turnout, don't be the person who follows the person who wrote the book called Why India Votes. It puts you in a very difficult position to say anything original on you. So Mukulika, thank you for being so absolutely superb in that overview. And then finally, also, I want to just credit the research assistants of Myra Ketarpal, a wonderful 12th standard student in Bangalore who has supported me over the last 2 weeks, really sort of thinking through what would be interesting to say on this in this discussion. So Rahul, I'm going to answer your questions, but before I do, I'm going to sort of take a step back and sort of maybe offer a bit of a critique of sort of how we think about the study of turnout in India, what are the limitations, and then maybe sort of what those opportunities are. And I'll try and do that as briefly as possible to allow lots of time for you to ask us questions, but also for the audience to ask us questions. So here is what we know. What we do know about turnout is really at the aggregate level. And this is not to discount the incredible anthropological insights at the micro level that Mukalika just shared. I'm talking as a political scientist, really thinking about sort of generalizable claims that we could make about turnout. We know these at the aggregate level. And we know them from two basic data sources. We have the official data provided to us by the Electoral Commission of India, and we have large nationally representative survey data. Both of these are limited and somewhat inherently so, but worth just acknowledging the limitations of these as we think about, therefore, what we can learn from the findings. The ECI data is extremely high quality. It has the advantage of being the official statistics. It has the advantage of obviously being pan-national, all three levels of voting that Indians participate in, the panchayat, the state, and obviously the national level. But what we lacked over there is clear standards and comparability over time of what the denominator in these measures are. Because as the electoral rolls change, as the purging of the electoral rolls, as the cleaning up of those electoral rolls, the denominator, right, which is critical to calculating the turnout rate, is also changing. And this makes any over time comparisons about turnout, turnout's gone up compared to the 1990s or down compared to the 1990s, inherently suspect. Not to say that we can't learn a lot from those overtime comparisons, but we want to be a little careful and ask ourselves, is it that the numerator is increasing and the denominator has stayed the same, generally turnout has increased? Or is it that, there might be more people voting as a function of larger population, etc. But in fact, the number of eligible voters in a given district has actually gone down, right? I mean, so let's just think about that a little bit. On the representative surveys, large representative sample surveys are the gold standard for studying individual level behavior. These can be aggregated because they're representative. They're extremely, extremely expensive. And in fact, the quality of most surveys being analyzed in Indian politics is pretty weak, right? And that's largely a function of the fact that gold standard nationally representative sample is so expensive. It is so time consuming. So we rely increasingly on phone surveys. We rely increasingly on internet opt-in surveys, and these are not generalizable to the population as a whole, at least not without a lot of fancy statistics that I suspect that most analysts are not using or employing. And so we want to be a little careful about any of those claims as well. Regardless of the data source, what both of them do better is description, right? They tell us in broad categories, men and women might have had a gender gap once that's narrowed. There used to be an urban gap that's narrowing. There might have been a youth gap that's narrowing or expanding. But what they don't tell us, and what the anthropological insights that Mukalika shared is so superior at, is getting at the why, right? Why do people vote? What explains these variations across time and space? One question that we should also then be thinking about is sort of, why does all this matter, right? And something, why should we worry about turnout? As a stylized fact, India's turnout is higher than any comparable democracy around the world, right? People vote. I mean, in a country like the United States, where I currently live, right, a vote turnout in the 50s is considered like an epic election, right? I mean, this is like mass enthusiasm. A 50% turnout rate in an Indian election, we'd all be sort of, there'd be, webinar after webinar as to what went wrong, why are Indians disenchanted with politics, etc. So we vote in the 65%. And in fact, the survey data insight I would offer is that the social desirability of voting in India is so high that, in fact, survey data voter turnout rates are in the 80s. So if we just look at the National Election Study and data on it and say, there's a question, did you vote in the last election? 80% of people say. We know 80% of the population didn't vote, right? But the clear social normative desirability of being seen as a voter is so high that people clearly misrepresent their actual vote over there. The point is, it's a country that votes. It's a country that votes at very high levels. I just want to echo what Rahul said. The stylized notion that is often trotted out that this high turnout has incumbency advantage and disadvantage. In particular, this, the pundit notion is that this is bad for incumbents, is not borne out by any data analysis, right? In 2008, Pradeep Chibba and I wrote a paper on electoral volatility in which we examined this mobilization hypothesis. Change in turnout has no effect whatsoever on electoral volatility in Indian elections. Milan Vaishnav and James Guy, in a paper in Studies in Indian Politics in 2018, examined the same thing in the context of incumbency advantage, found no such effect. Where there is some effect is maybe that this begins to shape public policy attitudes or public policy outcomes. So in the 2015 paper that Joel Simmons and I wrote in Electoral Studies, we show that in Indian states that have higher turnout, the shift of spending by the government shifts towards what we call public goods, more development expenditures, than to what we call club goods or private goods, etc. The logic is that when politicians understand that they have to keep many, many more people happy, right, millions of people happy, they focus on things that are more public good oriented. As turnout goes down, they can divide and conquer in different ways. They can use maybe identity appeals, clientelistic appeals, etc. But when you have to build a coalition that is literally millions of people strong, you can't play that game. You have to do more public good spending. I think that's an exciting avenue for us to be pursuing in the study of turnout, is actually to begin to link turnout to policy outcomes, as opposed to simply the outcomes of the elections. And this is a theme I'm going to come back to in a second. At the aggregate level, Rahul did an incredible job in his overview. He saved me a lot of time. Right, there's an urban-rural gap that has been well studied that appears to have narrowed. And in fact, and I see Sauradeep Banerjee is on this call. Sauradeep and Sanjay ji have a paper in EPW looking at the question about urban voting and actually making the point that it might be a bit misleading because so much of India actually now lives in that middle, right? Small towns on the urban periphery that are neither easily classified as rural nor urban, but that there is clearly some differences between the way middle-class urban voters engage this. And again, the Chiba Ahuja thesis is maybe worth engaging over here, etc. So there is that. The gender gap has been so beautifully covered by Mukulika and Rahul that I don't have to say anything. The youth gap is sort of interesting. There used to be one that appears to have gone away. Whether that's an artifact of 2014 and 2019, or whether it's a genuinely vanished gap, I think we'll only find out in 2024 and beyond. It does lead to a set of hypotheses that I think we should be honest and say we don't have good evidence on, whether the youth are more likely to have been engaged digitally, whether social media campaigns have been more effective at engaging the youth, or whether this is genuinely a change in orientation. I think one thing, there's two things that weren't said by my colleagues that I just want to highlight. The first is the assembly election versus general election difference. And one of the places where India is truly unique in the democratic universe is that turnout rates in state elections, that's called an assembly, Vidhan Sabha elections, is equal, if not higher, than turnout in general elections. Right, so Rahul, Jared Lieberman, and I engage in an ongoing research project trying to understand this, but it is striking that across the country, not every state, but most states, assembly turnout is as high, if not higher, than general assembly. This is exactly the opposite of anywhere else in the world, right? I mean, in the United States, where you have an electoral calendar of presidential elections, what we call midterm elections over here, which are only for the House and Senate, but not the president, have a much lower turnout rate than general elections where the president is up for re-election. But in India, it tells us that the state elections are seen as really important sites of political contestation, which again suggests to me that we are missing a big part of the story, because that hints to me that voters understand the policy outcomes that matter to them, right on the outcomes of these elections, and that state elections are really critical to the daily lives of people. The other sort of stylized fact, and I credit again Myra for coming up with this, is the state, and now I mean the big state, the national government, the ECI, has just done an incredible job of taking seriously the notion that every voter should be able to vote and lowering the barriers for voting, right? So all women polling stations in West Bengal, for instance, making it easier for vote by mail ballots for people with disabilities, for instance. In the Karnataka election that just concluded, 80% of the 400,000 persons with disabilities who were registered voted. 80% voted of people with disabilities. That, I think, is a testament to this deep commitment that the Indian state has historically had to lowering the barriers to voting. And again, this differs. In the US, when people study turnout, the main focus are the institutional impediments to voting, right? All the different ways in which the state actually makes voting hard. It's hard to register, it's hard to get to the ballot. The US elections on a Tuesday that are not a government holiday, right? Meaning that people who are working have to get there after work, etc. India does not have any of that. So let me then shift to the big lacuna, right? The big weakness and gaps in our understanding. And that is really the why question. And I want to sort of focus this on two things. The first is what we don't know is really individual level factors. So another way to think about it is we have pretty decent understanding at the aggregate level why these constituencies vote more than these constituencies. And then we infer from that individual level behavior, right? So we know that women vote at this rate relative to men. But that conclusion is not the same as saying that if you're a woman, you're more or less likely to. In the language of statistics, we call this an ecological fallacy or an ecological inference problem, inferring individual level behavior from aggregate level factors. If you want to flip it on a head, maybe a useful way to think about it is, what if you were advising a political campaign and you were going to tell them, hey, here's where you should target your rupees in terms of turning out the vote. Here's the kind of voter that is likely to vote. What advice would you want to give them? And we don't have a lot of really good advice over there. The reason we don't is because we treat voters really mechanically, right? We treat them as a set of sort of atoms that can be sort of almost activated. You warm it up and sort of all this, you get a whole bunch of activity among the atoms. But the individual atoms are not thinking. They're not sentient beings who are making their own decisions. Now, again, the anthropological insights on this are so much more nuanced and sophisticated. They treat people as whole people, right, who have brains and ideas. The political science literature has reduced them to a bunch of automatons whose votes can be bought for the price of a sari or a gas cylinder, right? Who basically don't have their own political opinions, are just simply told by local notables, go vote and here's who you're going to vote for instance. This kind of thinking, I'm going to just lump it all into the language of clientelism, I think has been truly destructive for the study of Indian politics. It has just meant that we focus on elites and party strategy. Rahul's question of party organizations comes to mind, because we haven't taken the individual seriously, right? I mean, we just don't think of the individual as making their own personal decision as to whether to vote in a given election. And the reason for that is because we don't think of the individual voter as being a policy, having policy preferences, coherent policy preferences that affect the decision. At the end of the day, we vote because we want a particular outcome from this election. That's a person we elected. But presumably we elect a particular person as opposed to someone else because we prefer their policy set to somebody else's, right? In other words, we have an ultimate outcome about what we want our governments to do or not do for us. This leads to a set of hypotheses that I think are yet to be even studied, let alone sort of come to conclusions. Does the intensity of our issue beliefs matter, right? Does someone who really, really, really cares about the Uniform Civil Code issue, are they more likely to come out to vote than not? In the US, again, the reaction to the Dobbs decision, in which the Supreme Court overturned women's right for reproductive choice in the context of abortion, is attributed with a pretty significant upsurge of women's voting in local elections, in state referenda, etc., right? A direct link between a particular policy decision and voter outcome. What would be the equivalent in the Indian context? And on this research that Pradeep Chibber is doing with Pranav Gupta, right, that he's in fact reported in the first of these webinars, of these talks that Rahul has organized, is that data are telling us more and more that voters, especially poor voters, are saying that they make their decision to vote about who to vote for very proximate to the election, a couple of days from the election. They're pretty undecided till then. And this leads to a bigger, I think, thornier academic question, which is the decision to turn out and the decision for whom to vote made simultaneously, or are these really independent decisions? Is it we will vote no matter what? Who we vote for on election day, that we'll see, right? But what is that decision going to be based on? Is it going to be based on highest bidder, the clientelistic kind of approach? Is it based on who makes the most persuasive appeal? Is it based on contact, mobilization? Is it candidates? Rahul and Pradeep's book, Ideology and Identity, right, points out about the role of individuals as vote mobilizers as opposed to the party organizations, analysis in chapter 7 of this really wonderful book of theirs. How should we think about this? But because we don't have answers to those questions, we don't have, I think, more sophisticated understandings at the individual level of how voters vote. So just to conclude and move us to conversation, just my takeaway points of this is, I think we have a really good descriptive understanding, and this is so beautifully visualized by the TCPD data, of how there is geographic and over time variation at the constituency and at state level in voting. This has led to some pretty strong stylized findings that I think we could, write a check on. Voters vote really high at high levels, both in assembly and general elections. The gap in gender has shrunk. The gap in youth voting youth versus old person voting has shrunk. There remains a bit of an urban-rural gap, but this is complicated by the proliferation of small towns and cities throughout the country in which a larger and larger share of Indians live. The middle class votes, but clearly engages the state differently, and there is a risk of a middle class disengagement, as Mukherjee says, as that group of Indians increasingly disengages from the public sector, right? It's just not, they see themselves as taxpayers, but not as the recipients of tax spending. How should we want to think about that? Is that even important for the study to turn out? But where the big lacuna is, we don't understand what's going on in people's heads because we don't have a policy theory of turnout, right? We have a mobilization theory of turnout, but we don't have a policy of turnout. And I think that's a great opportunity for scholarship going forward. So Rahul, over back to you. Thank you. Rahul, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Irfan. Now that we are running sort of like behind the schedule, rather than me asking questions, I'm going to basically, pull questions from the Q&A box. And so let me start with you, Irfan, something that you were emphasizing on, we don't have a good theory of individual motivations for voting. And so there is one question which is actually asking, on what basis are you saying that individuals get eclipsed in our focus on aggregates? After all, several surveys derive their conclusions on aggregates after interviewing individuals, often through random sampling. Now you are mute.
3 years of Zoom and we haven't learned much. That's a really good question. What I meant by that, and I hope I didn't overstate the claim, what I meant by that is the way our surveys are designed, you're absolutely right, are based on individuals. And what those allow us to do is to make aggregate claims. So we can take the surveys, multi-strata surveys that are representative at the state level, and we can generalize and say, okay, this, based on the sample survey, we are pretty confident that this percentage of voters voted in this particular state, higher than in the state, higher than in the last election, etc. What we don't have in those same surveys, right? And I'm a big fan, I'm part of the Lokniti team, right? Nothing but admiration for those survey analysts. But what we don't have yet are individual level questions that are that we can link credibly in survey analysis of here are the factors at the individual level that determine individual level decisions to vote. So the analysis that are produced both by the Lokniti team, but other scholars who use those kinds of survey data are still aggregate level analysis, right? There are trends about SCs voted at this rate, STs at this, OBCs at this, upper caste at this, women, men. What we don't have are the analyses at the level of sophistication that we do have in the study of Western Europe turnout, North America turnout, Australia, Japan, other established democracies, of saying, let's use the same survey data now to predict individual level decisions to vote or not. So that's what I mean by the individuals getting eclipsed. We tend to privilege communitarian or aggregate kind of conclusions out of our survey data, using the data to generalize and aggregate up, as opposed to using them to make individual level correlations.
And just to add to Irfan's point, something which he was mentioning about limitations of surveys to study this question. Actually, the social desirability bias makes like the numbers are around 90s, people who say we voted. Actually, 80 you get when, so Lokniti, the second question is just to check whether there is an ink on the finger or not, right? And even after checking the ink, the voting percentage is around 85, 86 in the survey. So what happens that you have very few numbers of people who are saying that they didn't vote. And that's why, like, doing that kind of analysis, the individual motivations, which Irfan is talking, it becomes difficult. Now, let me turn to Mukulika and actually ask a question about women voters, since she focused her opening remarks on that. And so pardon me for, like, I may not be able to frame this question well. So the question is following. Now, what, like, not only we are witnessing increased turnout among women, we are also witnessing actually household level splitting in vote. Women seems to be, and I, like, not just women, even it might be happening along the age lines, but it seems that there is a gender split happening on who people are voting for, right? And so I'm just thinking, and especially, like, can you elaborate on this? Have you seen something like this happening in West Bengal, that the, like, men and women of the household are voting for different parties? Is it also leading to some sort of, like, household discord? Now that we are also in the world of political polarization in India, choosing different parties within the household, is it leading to some sort of, like, discord in the family?
Interestingly, in 2019, when I was in West Bengal, I was very interested to see the visibility of the BJP, right? And I wrote a short piece in Indian Express about it. And there, in fact, there was a very interesting coalition between mothers and sons. I proposed then that the enthusiasm for the BJP through its mobilization of Hanuman Puja and Hanuman Jayanti was something that appealed to young men. And these young men who for nearly over 40 years had been caught in the tension between the left front and Trinamool, Congress and then Trinamool, found the BJP as their party that they could own, that wasn't their parents'. And it was low caste, at least in my case, where I know the families incredibly well. It was the low caste Hindu women who supported their sons because they felt that they could appeal to a different identity that wasn't a class identity, as had been done, or indeed gender identity. And that, so there's a, and in those cases, there was, I wouldn't say there was discord, but I think it was quite evident. They were telling me, because they knew me and trusted me, I really did not see the women talk in front of their husbands about wanting to support the BJP, but it was quite evident what they were doing. And the young sons didn't say anything in front of their fathers. But the fact that this is splitting, I cite their paper, Prannoy Roy and his co-author, they talk about the secrecy of women's vote and the overestimation of our numbers of how women are told who to vote for in the past. And they sort of tested this and showed that actually women are making up their own minds. So it is partly this idea that women will vote who they're told to vote. They do this to keep the peace, to present themselves in front of the survey researcher, because often there is an audience when they're talking and they want to be seen to be saying the right thing. But the very fact that women may be voting differently, and it's impossible to establish this completely. But one thing that we saw, and you will remember from Bihar onwards, that Nitish Kumar's targeted policies towards young girls paid great dividends. And now Mamata in West Bengal, there it is quite interesting where, I mean, the point is that if you target women's welfare, free bus rides in Karnataka, that not only gets the women behind it, but in many cases it gets parents and other people behind it as well. So, the splitting is not always along gender lines. You may expect that the young men might get alienated, but the fathers might not. So the splitting is different. If I may, Rahul, just because I'm speaking and because it's important, I just want to go back to the Ahuja and Chibber point. I wasn't saying that it is, if I use the word clientelistic, that was wrong, but what is different is that they attribute the idea of civic duty to the urban middle classes, but not to the rural. And that is not, that is, certainly all my research in rural India, in various parts of India, that's simply not the case. I think there is, and it sort of evokes the political society versus civil society distinction that Partha Chatterjee made. And it's not the case. There is a great civic sense in rural India too, which needs to be recognized as a motivation for voting.
Okay. No, I agree with you. I think their understanding of civic duty versus rights is in a different context, but we'll come back to it at some point later. Irfan, if I may bring you in here, which is, in the beginning, you also mentioned about why over time comparisons are hard to do in India, especially because electoral rolls are in continuous sort of like what quote unquote election commission would call as cleaning the rolls, right? Basically trying to remove the duplicates and those kind of things. And that's why denominator is continuously changing. So things become hard. But something I would also like Mukulika to come in at some stage after you answer, which is there is also allegation of like in this process of cleaning and deleting and adding, there's also a lot of perhaps forgeries happening. The ruling parties in the state might be able to, delete voters who they think might not vote for them and like get bogus voters voted in the list. And since Irfan, you've done some election forensics, do you to what extent do you think this is happening in India of 2020s? Was it a case of like we have anecdotal stories of 60s and 70s? Is it happening now? Or if it's happening, like, are there some states who are doing it more compared to other? And I know you may not have a fine, evidence-based answer to it, but anything that you could add, since there were a couple of questions related to this.
You're a troublemaker, Rahul. You're trying to get me in trouble. Yeah, what do you want me to name states that I think are funding the election? Look, I think the larger point you make is that we don't know, and that the state of election forensics research in India is really, really limited, which is a shame, because I suspect that on the whole, it would yield real confirmation that India's elections are extremely high quality affairs, right? But we're allergic to this. So you will recall, Rahul, over a decade ago when Pradeep, you and I had a chance to present to the Election Commission of India, right? I mean, some 25, all the election commissioners from the entire country in the same room, and we presented to them data analysis. And the part I was presenting that day was on how the commission, ECI, could bring in election forensics insights into being able to analyze very quickly which polling booth, even at the level of the polling booth, which polling booths might be suspect, right? Not found guilty, but suspect. That would therefore allow them to target their resources. And the response of these incredibly, dedicated, talented commissioners, again, it's over a decade ago, none of them are serving any longer, I suspect, but was, we don't need that. We know, right? We can tell. We have all the people on the ground. And I think that's a missed opportunity because we simply don't have the answer. That said, your home state of UP, I looked into this with polling level station data, and it's pretty clear that there are this at the polling station that on a normal election forensic kind of stuff, like the work I've done on Latin America, for instance, pop out as being these are suspect, right? We would want to look into these polling stations for turnout rates that are 100%, where the incumbents are getting 95% of the reported vote, etc., or just really, really skewed. Do I think this is systematic enough? Do I think there's even hints that this is systematic enough to warrant sort of concerns that this affects the integrity of the elections? I do not, right? But I think that it's a kind of concern, especially as there remain opportunities. You look at how the anti-democratic wave around the world has played out, and a large part of that is casting doubt about the outcome of elections by taking advantage of people's ignorance and lack of information around how EVMs work, for instance, right? I mean, all this kind of stuff. When you take one anecdote, generalize it out. The West Bengal elections, case in point, I'll turn this to Mukulika in a second, but one of the questions in the Q&A asks about violence, right? And I think this is one of those places where we need to broaden our thinking about what electoral integrity looks like. I mean, these elections that are increasingly marked by violent incidents where candidates are literally beaten up, if not killed, the party workers on both sides are getting attacked. That has a devastating impact on voter confidence and confidence in the outcome of elections. And I think that's a much bigger concern, bluntly, than sort of what might be happening behind the scenes in a particular polling booth, a particular polling station. I don't want to diminish that, but I don't think that's where the action is. I think the action is more on these macro factors that kind of are linked to the undermining of individual citizens' confidence. So Ursula Daxiker at the University of Amsterdam and her colleague Neeraj Prasad, also at Amsterdam, have a big ERC, European Research Consortium, the grant looking at sort of violence in the local elections in India. West Bengal is a major site of the study that they're doing. And it's pretty clear from their research that, that the spike in violence and concerns over violence in West Bengal elections is affecting how voters think about the engagement of the elections and the legitimacy of the outcomes of those elections. And now West Bengal has a set of factors that be treated as somewhat unique in the Indian context, but it isn't. UP has some similar dynamics in some parts of UP than others, and we'd hate to see that spread. And I think that would be a really fascinating area of future research. So I've kind of dodged your question, Rahul, but
no, thank you.
I think the rich amount of data we do have access to, because we do get these polling station level data, is a tremendous opportunity for election forensics. And since we do have Gilles attending this call, I think it's the kind of place where TCPD or someone else that is aggregating those data anyway could easily build in algorithms in the back end where we could be getting this from a credible, open source kind of way. So that, and I think on the whole, it would confirm that these elections are really free and fair, really clean, high level, high quality affairs, but begin to maybe hone our understanding and even actually counter some of the misinformation that is going to inevitably be part of election discourse going forward.
Okay. Thank you, Irfan. Mukulikaji, particularly on this point of, what you'll call as bogus voters, violence, and especially you study Bengal. Bengal, in some ways, to students of Turnout, would be an anomaly, given even the recent panchayat election. So there is a comparatively higher level of violence, or at least that's what gets reported. Despite that, we continue to see very high level of engagements also, people participate. And so how does these two things, which is violence on one hand and high electoral participation on other hand, go together?
In West Bengal's case, Rahul, you've got to remember that this is not violence that is suddenly occurring now. In a sense, the legacy of the left front is one of violence. I mean, there is the amount of blood in Indian elections and Indian democracy more generally is actually so ubiquitous that we don't talk about it enough, because it's just part of Indian politics. I just Lipin Ram, a doctoral student at Geneva, who's just about to publish his book on Kerala politics. There is myth making around the blood spilt of revolutionaries and so on. And these are not a one-off. This is hundreds and thousands of people being killed. And these are not one-off cases, as we were saying. Bengal does get reported more in panchayat elections. We know why it gets reported more, because of a biased media. But this was the case throughout the left frontiers when I was there as well. And unfortunately, the legacy has continued to form the grammar of politics. Right? This has continued now. And unfortunately, again, I think there is a sort of normalization of this, that there will be violence, but that can't stop you from going to vote, because people also have been educated in that grammar for over 4 decades now. So it doesn't stop people unless there is intimidation. Then obviously people would rather not vote than get killed or get beaten up. And this is something that, again, will not get reported in mainstream media, but it is quite interesting how it's happening in rural and urban areas in UP, for instance. People are just being told they cannot come out of their mohallas and go to vote. They will be beaten up, they will be killed. So people are choosing to stay at home because they want to vote, but not so much that at the risk of being killed. In urban areas, what, again, one's hearing this anecdotally, but it is true. It's anecdotal, but it's entirely true that people get now threatening telephone calls on their mobiles, telling them if you are seen coming out on polling day, you will be killed or your family will be targeted and so on. Now, I've mentioned this particular example because it tells us something about the nexus of violence as well. So it's not just getting names of voters list. Residents' welfare associations, RWAs are then supplying phone numbers to party workers of particular categories of people, and let's not beat about the bush. In many cases, this is Muslims who are directly threatened on their phone saying, if you come out or else. So, Rahul, if I may have one more minute just to say, I've thought about your question on violence, but I want to also, since Irfan's been talking about electoral integrity, I think it is important for us to recognize that elections as they occurred before 2014, when I was studying them in 2009 with the team, and what is it now, there are three key differences, I think, which we need to recognize. One is and this is very difficult for us as researchers, for us polling booth data is gold because we can do that kind of fine-grained analysis. But for the voter, polling booth data is a disaster. It is a complete compromise of the secrecy of the ballot because every 1,000 voters, who's voting where. And if you work on the ground as a party worker, you know exactly which households have voted for which party. So the Election Commission of India commissioned a machine that would mix votes. It's called the totalizer, but the BJP and other parties have blocked it because for political parties and cadre-based parties in particular, having booth level data is absolutely critical. And Arun Jaitley used to call this booth management, which basically meant that you keep, and remember Maneka Gandhi said this in a public meeting, we will know how you voted and there will be consequences. The leadership shut her down and censured her, but it was said, everybody heard it, and the cat was in a sense out of the bag. That's one. So the secrecy of our ballot is actually severely compromised. Secondly, electoral bonds have come in. So what we are seeing when we talk about money and muscle in Indian elections, money has always been a problem, but now it is of a different scale of problem, right? There is the kind of money that is available is of a completely different magnitude. This does not mean that the richest party wins elections always. This has also been true of Indian elections right from 1950 onwards. But it is true that when there is excessive money, when there is vigilante groups, when there is large numbers of unemployed men available, made unemployed because of lack of jobs, but also because of GST and its consequences, you have a standing paid army of mercenaries and vigilantes who are there to inflict the violence at a different organized level. So electoral bonds and its consequences, we need to think about. Again, our discussion of money in elections, I think post-electoral bonds is a different order. And thirdly, this pains me hugely because like Irfan has been saying, many of us have worked with the Election Commission of India and its officials when they did have a reputation for probity, and that has come into question now increasingly. They're not seen to be quite as impartial as they used to be. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Irfan, my last question to you, which is, and you seem to have answered a bit to Sarthak, but I just wanted to sort of like open this, not just limited to Sarthak's question, which is, as India urbanizes, which is happening, and migration from rural areas are also increasing. So one hypothesis which Sarthak proposed, which is basically to do with, men are migrating to cities and women folks representing the household are actually coming out to vote, right? And that may be driving some of the women turnout. I think it's one of the factors. It doesn't explain the entirety of increase in women turnout. But do you think, like, because the election commission says that they have all kinds of facilities for people to get enrolled, even if you have like lived in a place for 6 months. Do you think we'll face a similar kind of problem where a large number of people who might migrate to cities will not be able to exercise their basic right to vote? Of course, Election Commission is exploring different options. How can this be done? Like, so in that sense, like in the short run, do you think this would be a problem for Indian democracy, where we'll be like in some ways like not by choice but by design, or the way things are moving, will disenfranchise a lot of citizens?
I think it's a logistical challenge that then has creates political opportunities for for the for a party with the wrong incentives to disenfranchise. So that's a very academic, mealy-mouthed kind of sentence, and let me unpack that. The logistical challenge is that the kind of scale of urban mobility and just mobility more generally in India is huge. I mean, I think most of us have notions of what the scale of internal migration and internal mobility in India is, but it is the largest anywhere in the world, right? There are more people moving who live and work in places that they don't consider their native home than anywhere else, right? There's the circular migration patterns in India, right? Kind of on an epic proportion. And at election time, this raises two questions. The first is, where should these people be allowed to vote, right? And the second is, for what constituency are they voting? So one possibility is we say, regardless of where you're living, you identify your native place in a particular constituency, right? Where you've got a house, you're a resident, permanent residence. And so you get to do what in the US we use the language of absentee balloting, right? So my vote is being counted over there. The other is to say that actually, if I'm spending 6 months of the year or 7 months or even maybe longer, but I still think of Muluk as being somewhere else, the Muluk is irrelevant. I'm a resident of this particular constituency for the purposes of my day-to-day life, and therefore I should be able to vote over here. The answers to those are not a priori clear, right? There's no right answer to which way you do that, but those have political consequences. If we allow people to vote where they're currently living, right, on the day of the election, that changes the dynamics of that constituency. If we allow them to vote as absentees in the place that they left behind, that maybe they sort of haven't even been home to for many months, right, and we don't require that they go home to vote kind of thing, that creates some interesting dynamics. And suddenly you've got a whole bunch of people who are your constituency but don't actually live in that particular place. Again, no right answer, but we got some issues. The challenge, of course, is that for incumbents and for incumbent governments in both of those contexts, right, the place where the migrants are now living, the place from where the migration occurred, have incentives to think about, do I think of these migrants as my voters or not my voters? And if they're not my voters, let's make it hard for them to vote in my constituency. If they are, let's encourage them to vote over here. Again, I keep using the US example because it's worth sort of fighting the sort of Indian exceptionalism over here. This is not an Indian problem, it's all democracies have these issues. In the US, college towns are real pockets of democratic support, right? University towns. And in red states, right, Republican-controlled states, there is increasingly a fight to make it very hard for college students to vote absentee or to vote in the place where they're going to college, because it is completely changing the dynamics of it. So it's, the Midwest of America, which is heavily Republican dominated at the state level, these urban centers where universities and colleges are big blue spots kind of thing. And so we see a political incentive to make it harder because of the migration patterns. So I think that's what we have to be keeping an eye on, is whether or not the policy making keeps the individual at the center of the decision making. As you put it, we have a constitutional right to cast our vote. It is for the ECI to figure out how to make that logistically feasible, right? As opposed to allowing politics to enter that question and say, hey, we don't want a bunch of migrants voting in our local elections, etc. And then, of course, there's different levels. In Bombay, where I grew up, you could imagine that a migrant from UP or Bihar might want to vote in a UP-Bihar state election, but vote in a Bombay Municipal Corporation, a BMC corporator election, right? And those are both legitimate, but how do we decide that and how do we think about that? I do think that this question, and I try to answer it in my response through the Q&A to Saptarkar, is that I think the gender dynamic is worth really us knowing more, and I'll defer to Mukulika. She probably has really deep insights on this, but my sense of Ritika Kumar's research, for instance, is that we do get this really interesting dynamic where women-headed households in villages where the male head of household is now absentee have different political preferences and intuitions than those in which, right? And so what Ritika claims to show from her research is that if the men are home, right, from the city, right, women answer questions differently when they ask about politics and if the men are away. For instance, Iram Haider and I have a working paper showing that women answer political questions differently if there's any other adult in the room than if they ask that question alone, right? Which I think can be generalized again to think about the changing family dynamics from out migration. So again, I think this is just an area of tremendous opportunity for research, but I don't have the answers quite clearly.
No, thank you, Irfan, and thank you, Mukulika. Of course, there are a lot of questions which we have not been able to touch and answer, but the idea of this seminar series is not to answer everything. It's actually to raise questions, right? And in some ways, what I'm like in last three talks, like if I have to make one line conclusion, which is we know few things about our politics, but we don't know a lot of things, right? And so if going forward in these 24 conversations, if we can like create a body where, these are the things which we have fairly good sense of what's happening to our politics, and then these are the things which we need to research on. Perhaps by the time 2024 elections come face to face, we'll be in much better position not to just understand elections, why people are voting, but also where Indian democracy is heading. So thank you again, everyone who joined us today, Mukulika and Irfan in particular. We look forward to everyone for our next talk, which is going to be on 8th with Yamini Iyer and Rahul Mukherjee. And after that, we'll have Ashutosh Vashne and Partha Mukhopadhyay. Both of them would happen at CPR conference room. So those who can join us in person, please do join us. We'll also have simultaneous Zoom link for those who can't join in person. Thank you again, everyone. Take care. For those of you who are in India, good night. Those like Irfan, have another cup of coffee and enjoy your day. And Mukulika, good day to you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Rahul.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.